Ladies and gentlemen, this is TVP World. I'm your host Benjamin Lee, and welcome aboard the Eastern Express. There are two Russias today. Now let me explain. One is fighting a war of attrition in Ukraine, the other is quietly learning how to live without waiting for Moscow's permission. Governors across the federation sit through their televised meetings with Putin, nodding dutifully as he gives them direct orders, but sometimes those get ignored. While Putin thinks he's performing absolute control, he's actually revealing selective weakness. He can command the battlefield, but he can't command his own bureaucracy anymore. And something even more remarkable is happening. Pro-Kremlin military analysts are beginning to speak truth that used to only appear in independent media. They now admit the Ukrainian economy is outperforming expectations, that the war lacks real progress, and that China may be exploiting Russia's weakness instead of helping it. For the first time, voices close to the Ministry of Defense are asking, why are we standing still? Without further ado, let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
Across Russia's regions, presidential involvement has become the norm. From high rates of alcoholism in Magadan to failing hospitals in Transbaikal, Moscow's instructions pile up faster than they can be carried out. Vladimir Putin's list, quote, systemic problems, governors promise action, and then little change ever comes. Putin's campaign against alcoholism shows a distinct pattern. Since 2021, the Kremlin urged three regions to pay special attention to rising dependency. And despite the appearance in reports of new sports halls and cultural centers, Magadan still drinks above the national average, and Kirov remains among Russia's heaviest drinking regions per capita. Social services follow the same script. In Transbaikal, hospital closures continue despite demands for improvement. In Voronezh, road accidents increased after Putin flagged the issue. Governors admit privately that the orders are vague, budgets tight, and the war keeps pushing major deadlines to the right. Even loyalists fall short. Chechnya raised the numbers of available doctors but still lags behind the national average, while Novosibirsk failed to stop people from resigning as first responders. A few successes do stand out. Tomsk lowered its HIV rates, Amur reduced tuberculosis, and Chelyabinsk built new rural clinics. The bigger the project, the likely it is to fail. The trillion-ruble proposal to build a bridge linking the island of Sakhalin to mainland Russia stalled immediately, and St. Petersburg quietly buried a Kremlin-suggested metro extension. While federal cash is limited, presidential ideas rarely leave the page, yet the mythology of Putin's green folder persists, a symbol of consistent scrutiny that keeps governors focused on loyalty over results. Some who have failed to meet the most targets now serve as ministers, while diligent performance remain in place.
And now, let's zone in on the East-planning portion of our show. For nearly 25 years, Vladimir Putin has been transforming Russia's regional elites into a tightly controlled hierarchy. But as new political cycles approach, analysts warn that Putin's engineered stability may contain future risks. Here is how that threat potentially unfolds.
Since the early 2000s, governors have been appointed, rotated, or sentenced to regions unfamiliar to them, which prevents local communities from retaining political independence from Russia. These outside governors inevitably remodeled the administrations into Kremlin-backed apparatuses. Now, because this model has managed to remove Ukraine's most powerful barons in the 1990s, today's Ukrainian elites are unlikely to mount a coordinated challenge against Moscow. But Russia's system now faces internal pressure points, one of which is the 2026 Duma elections, where any local unrest or mismanagement tempt ambitious regional figures to see how far they can distance themselves from Moscow while still appearing loyal. The larger risk for Putin comes in 2027-2028, when many governors and regional business leaders will have reached the limit of their terms, a decade in office. Putin must decide whether to keep them and risk stagnation or replace them and anger a generation of officials who expect to be rewarded for their loyalty. Either choice is bound to create friction for Moscow that can't easily be predicted and/or contained. As of today, Putin's centralized system remains stable. However, the next rotation of elites may trigger new tensions, and not from the Kremlin's oppositional figures, but rather from within the Kremlin's official ranks.
And now, let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. Vladimir Putin set out to present a Russia united under one command. Instead, he may have accidentally revealed a country drifting away from its control. Since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine began, he has spent more and more time on the war effort and less on the federation he still claims to command. His solution to the growing distance between Moscow and the regions was to hold televised meetings with governors where each was given a set of specific orders. It was meant to show leadership. Instead, it showed the opposite. More than half of those orders were never carried out. Russians can't see this, and when a strongman says do it and nothing happens, power begins to slip in silence. The more he looks west towards the battlefield, the more regional power quietly grows in the shadows. Some governors, like Ramzan Kadyrov, have built their own semi-independent fiefdoms. Others simply learn a new rule. If Putin's focus is elsewhere, you can't build your own policy at home. Alexander Karachev, the Kremlin's chief sociologist, now considers this one of the 5 biggest threats to Putin's regime. And yet, it is barely discussed on television. Why? Because the president cannot punish people whose support he may need tomorrow. And governors know that. But within the propaganda itself, something much bigger is shifting. Pro-Kremlin military analysts are now admitting that Ukraine's economy is standing firm, that Russia's own industry is shrinking outside the war sector, and that China is exploiting Russia's needs rather than partnering with them. For the first time since the war began, analysts at Military Review, a site close to the Ministry of Defense, admitted that Ukraine's economic situation is stable. Moscow wanted to convince Russians that Kyiv was collapsing, but now Russia's own loyal war correspondents are saying, damn, they're coping even harder than we are. Leaked FSB documents now depict China as a potential long-term threat, accused of harvesting Russian technologies, recruiting Russian scientists, and possibly preparing territorial claims. Some analysts predict major cracks will emerge by 2026 ahead of Duma elections and elite reshuffles. If Putin protects entrenched governors, the system could sink into stagnation and corruption. If he replaces them, the retired elites might feel betrayed and become rivals. Meanwhile, the governors are preparing for something Putin refuses to acknowledge: a Russia that may outgrow him. He is commanding a war, but Russia itself could begin to command Putin. The longer it goes on, the more power shifts sideways to governors, to military industry monopolies, to regional elites, and even to China. One day, Putin's war will end. And when it does, he may discover that Russia is no longer waiting for orders. And now, to shed more light on the issue, is Paul Goebel, Distinguished Senior Fellow from Jamestown Foundation. Hello, sir, and welcome to Eastern Express.
Thank you for having me.
So today we are taking a look at Russia's internal politics that seems to have been in a little bit of a chaotic mess due to Vladimir Putin's attention being directed towards the war. Now, a lot of articles are coming out saying that essentially he's losing grasp of his own internal politics. Is that a very big problem going forward?
I think it's a very big problem. Mr. Putin has destroyed most of the institutions that would ride herd on a lot of issues, and as a result, he has to make a lot of decisions, or someone very close to him has to make a lot of decisions, and then hope that giving an order will be sufficient. It's difficult for any one person to keep track of everything, and clearly in the last 3.5 years, Vladimir Putin has been far more focused on what's going on in Ukraine and relations with the West than he is on what's going on inside his own country. Not surprisingly, some officials have taken advantage of that situation to operate on their own. Consequently, you have much more diversity as far as policy implementation is concerned. It's not so much that they're challenging the Kremlin as they're simply ignoring a Kremlin that isn't giving them the kind of orders and supervision that they would normally have expected.
Putin said to have entrusted power to some of his close circle, but then it does also seem like a lot of people are not exactly following the orders. Where do you think the communication chain kind of break down that led to what you describe as, a lot of people doing their own thing?
Well, first off, I think we have to understand that Putin's circle, his close circle, is pretty small. He's hoped to carefully select governors so they'll do what they're told without being creative. But when you have more than 80 governors out there, some are going to go their own way. It's just the nature of things. In the Kremlin itself, the domestic policy shop, if you can call it that, doesn't have more than perhaps a dozen senior people, and perhaps only 3 or 4 who have access to Putin. So if you figure that out, if you think about that and you think about Putin's attention mostly to Ukraine and relations with the West rather than the situation in his own country, it's in the nature of things that Moscow isn't going to pay attention to everything, that people are going to be able to do some of their own things, often at variance with what Mr. Putin probably wants. And he can intervene, he can override almost anything if he chooses to, but his attention is elsewhere, and he doesn't have the structured bureaucracy that will guarantee that when he gives an order, it works down to the very lowest levels without problems.
Do you think this also exposes the flaw of how politics are being conducted within Russia, being we follow orders simply and not really asking any question? Now that Putin is being occupied, there doesn't seem to be a lot of unity and a lot of thought into how things should be conducted, and hence kind of this fragmentation that we're seeing.
Well, I think that's true. I mean, Mr. Putin's decision to destroy institutions so that his personalist power would be unquestioned has had the effect that when he looks away from a particular area, people are likely to do their own thing. At least some people are. I think Mr. Putin has something that has worked very well to give him the unchallenged personal power he wants. But on the other hand, it means that he doesn't have the structures where if he gives an order to the top man, it will be instantly carried out. It will be communicated all the way down, and there will be a monitoring of whether things are actually done as he would like. So it's one of these, he gets a benefit from it, but he's created a threat. And the longer he's in power, the longer he's in office, let's put it that way, the more this is going to emerge. We're now seeing it quite often in a number of the ethnic Russian federal subjects as well as the non-Russian republics. All too often, people ignore these things because they aren't covered in the Moscow media. And so things go on for some time. But if you look at decisions being made in Sakha, Yakutsk, and elsewhere, what you can see is that a lot of governors are doing things that in no way are what Vladimir Putin would want, and no one's challenging them very much. If that goes on for a while, then he has real problems, especially when he's in the process of trying to reintegrate some of the 700,000 veterans of his war in Ukraine.
And speaking of internal propaganda as well as messaging, there's recently analysts coming out from Russia saying that even kind of questioning how they're doing in the war front, saying that their supposed dominance against Ukraine isn't really that strong as well. Are we seeing the cracks of these narrative control that even the Kremlin cannot control what sort of information is coming out any longer?
Well, the Kremlin was never in total control of all information people could gain access to. Hence its moves to attack the internet and to shut it down in many regions all too often. The fact that the war has gone on so long, and please remember the beginning, the Kremlin was promising a war over in 3 days. Well, when that didn't happen, a lot of people drew the obvious conclusion that things weren't going as well as Mr. Putin had suggested they would. As the war has gone on, whatever victories the Russian government has won, people are asking the question, what's the cost? How many Russians are dying to acquire this few square kilometers of Ukrainian land? So that kind of thing is inevitable as the war goes on, precisely because Putin keeps saying Russia's winning, 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 but in fact, the amount of territory it's taking is not nearly as great as all that. Ukraine has won this war just as Finland won its war 80 years ago by preventing the supposedly undefeatable Soviet or now Russian army from advancing and taking all its goals. Many people assumed when Stalin went into Finland, he would occupy Finland. He didn't. He took a loss. Many people assumed that Putin going into Ukraine would quickly occupy and overthrow the government. He hasn't done that. He hasn't occupied a large percentage of the territory of that country. So clearly people are going to ask questions in their own minds. That doesn't mean they're going to tell pollsters anything. That doesn't mean they're going to say we're losing. It does mean, however, that people are going to be naturally suspicious and even increasingly suspicious of Kremlin claims about the great victories that the Russian army is supposedly achieving. I just don't think that people understand what a victory Ukraine has already won by defeating the Russian army that was supposedly going to be in Kiev in 3 days. That is an enormous accomplishment given the relative size of the militaries of the two countries. It shows just how weak Russia in fact is and just how strong Ukraine is, something that unfortunately many people in the West have not taken seriously and into account in their proposals for what should be done next. Mr. Putin now is quite obviously counting on some kind of peace offering from the West to stop the war so that he can claim a victory he has not been able to achieve on the battlefield.
Right, and it seems like a lot of these authoritarian regimes do use a war as a means to consolidate its power as well. But with Putin focusing on a war that led to him losing grasp on his own politics, is it safe to say that the decision has essentially backfired?
Well, I think the decision has backfired. It's worked in part in that clearly Mr. Putin has been able to prevent the emergence of a systematic opposition to him because most people will end up rallying around the flag when their country is at war. On the other hand, it's undercut his ability to run the country, and the longer the war goes on, the more that will happen. That's yet another reason why Mr. Putin is desperately hoping that some in the West who don't appear to understand what is going on will give him a victory that otherwise he could not achieve.
Thank you so much for your input and insight. Really appreciate it. And thanks for being with us on Eastern Express. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
And now we're moving on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you don't want to miss. The Kremlin has approved a long-term strategy that formally includes 4 occupied Ukrainian regions into Russia's national policy through 2036.
Putin's decree mandates full integration of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia and Kherson into Russia's legal, cultural and education systems, including youth indoctrination programs that feature a mandatory shift to Russian. Rights groups say the document codifies the erasure of Ukrainian identity, violating multiple international laws that ban annexation and forced mobilization. The plan is to adopt a Russian civic identity by 2036, with implementation beginning on 1st of January.
Ukraine's political crisis deepened this week as former presidential chief of staff and Volodymyr Zelensky's closest ally, Andriy Yermak, resigned from his position, while ex-ambassador Oksana Makarova was appointed as top economic advisor.
Yermak resigned amid a sweeping corruption probe tied to state nuclear operator Energoatom, insisting that he stepped aside to avoid damaging President Volodymyr Zelensky's reputation. He said he was prepared for any reprisals. Investigators searched his home, but without taking formal actions. Makarova, who coordinated early U.S. support for Ukraine during Russia's full-scale invasion, will now serve as an unpaid advisor on reconstruction and investment. Kyiv faces a widening budget gap, battlefield pressure and U.S. insistence on rapid peace talks, increasing the stakes on Zelensky's reshuffle.
Ukraine's former military commander Valery Zaluzhny has called for political reforms once a peace deal is reached, as Kyiv faces its most turbulent domestic moment in years.
Writing in The Telegraph, Zaluzhny said peace would offer an opportunity for Ukraine to rebuild their institutions and confront corruption, while discouraging any hurried but short-sighted agreements that might sacrifice independence. His comments come amid the fallout from Yermak's resignation, which exposed a corruption scandal that toppled key ministers. Zaluzhny, now Ukraine's ambassador to the UK, remains one of the country's most popular figures and a potential future presidential candidate, though he denies political ambitions as long as Ukraine's at war.
And that's all on this episode of Eastern Express. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.